So the agenda for today just consists of going over the eligibility requirements for partial sales tax, and we'll also go over the exemption certificate. Then we're going to go over the BearBuy process. So after you've completed the exemption certificate, what do you do in BearBuy? And then we do want to go over the resources and support that we've developed for this process. And then again, questions will be left for the end. So let's go ahead and get started on just what this new process is. So this mainly came out of legislation from the state. They noticed, or they stated, that businesses primarily engaged in manufacturing or in research and development in the fields of biotech or physical engineering or life sciences are able to purchase or lease manufacturing or research equipment, research and development equipment, at a reduced sales and use tax rate for purchases occurring on or after July 1st, 2014. So with that, UCOP stated that effective July 1st, 2014, the California State Board of Equalization passed this new legislation allowing a partial sales and use tax rate reduction of 4.1875% for qualified persons using qualified property for qualified activities. So what I do want to note is the rate. The new, or the partial sales tax rate reduction, is of 4.1875%. It's not to 4.1875%. So what that means is that the state portion of the tax will be reduced by 4.1875%. Okay. The other tax piece, the tax rate, will be determined based on the local taxes, so where the items are being shipped to. Okay. So again, in order to get this reduced rate, it has to be a qualified person purchasing qualified property used for qualified activity. So what I'm going to do in the next slide is just explain what qualified person, property, and activity mean for the UC. So when it comes to UC, when we're talking about the qualified person, entity, or establishment, we're mainly looking at the research funds. So since we at UC Berkeley use or are composed of research funds for more than 50% of our funding, we qualify as an entity for this partial sales tax exemption. So you'll notice that on the form, and that we're going to go over in a bit, it does ask for the qualified person's name. In this case, the qualified person is UC Berkeley. When it comes to qualified tangible personal property, it's just meaning it's mainly referring to machinery, equipment, as well as the lease for that equipment, computers and software, as well as special purpose buildings, used 50% of the time in California for qualified activity and have a useful life of more than 1 year. So I'm going to go into detail on what we mean by machinery and equipment, but the key here is that it has to be used 50% of the time in California, and it has to be used for qualified activity for more than 1 year, or for a year or more. When we refer to qualified uses, what this mainly means is that the property needs to be used in research and development, either in biotechnology, physical engineering, or life sciences. So the only equipment or machinery that can be claimed is if it's being used for research and development. So this mainly affects departments that are heavy with research and development purchases. So let's go over qualified activity. Again, I mentioned a qualified person is the organization primarily engaged, either 50% or more, in a qualified activity. So this means that UC Berkeley is the qualified person according to the State Board of Equalization. When we say qualified activity, this mainly means using the property that's being purchased, primarily meaning more than 50% of the time, in manufacturing, processing, fabricating, refining, or recycling of tangible personal property, as well as research and development anywhere in California. So key here is that the manufacturing or the equipment needs to be used in California for research and development. Qualified activity also includes using the property primarily to maintain, repair, measure, or test any other qualified personal property described in the previous sentence. So this means if there's any maintenance or repairs needed to be conducted on qualified purchases, then the maintenance is also covered, as well as any replacement pieces and so on. Qualified property includes machinery and equipment with a useful life greater than 1 year that is used in qualified activity. And we do list out what that means or what that entails. It mainly entails machinery and equipment, as well as any component parts and contrivances such as belts, shafts, moving parts, and operating structures. So anything that makes up that equipment is also qualifies for the partial sales tax exemption. Equipment and devices used or required to operate, control, regulate, or maintain the machinery also qualify, and that includes computers, data processing, equipment, computer software, and so on. Special purpose buildings and foundations are also included, but not limited to cleaning rooms, climate control facilities, wind tunnels, and linear accelerators. And non-depreciable property like leased computers used for more than 50% of the time also qualify, as long as they're being used for qualified activity. So that's what does qualify. What doesn't qualify are any consumables with a useful life of less than 1 year, any tangible personal property used primarily for administration, general management, or marketing, furniture, inventory, and equipment used in the extraction process, or equipment used to store finished products that have completed the manufacturing, processing, refining, fabricating, or recycling process. So this kind of includes those refrigerators that may be used to store any equipment that needs to dry and so on. Those types of equipment don't qualify. So that was just the requirements that the SBOE has set. And part of the requirement is that an exemption certificate should be accompanied or should accompany every item being purchased. So what I'm going to do now is just go over the exemption certificate in detail. So a partial exemption certificate for manufacturing, research, and development equipment is required to be completed for every product and attached to every BearBuy card at UC Berkeley. The certification should be completed by the shopper, as it confirms the product being purchased is qualified property being used for a qualified activity by a qualified person. Students, workers can also sign or fill out the form as long as the department gives them the authority to do so. Since student workers or even GSR students are considered UC Berkeley employees, they are allowed by the SBOE to sign the form. But it's up to the department to identify if that's what the GSR will be doing. So it's a department-based decision. So there are 3 sections on the certification: the seller-lesser section, the identification of qualified property section, and the shopper verification section. Each section has to be completed. If any of these sections are omitted, the certification is considered incomplete. Please note that UC Berkeley must have taken title to the equipment on or after July 1st, 2014 in order for the purchase to qualify. So this means that there is that period where that checkbox is not available in BearBuy. So there's some transactions that do qualify and should have been claimed that now would need to follow a retroactive refund process. So departments can request a partial sales or use tax refund on qualified property if it was not previously claimed. To do so, you would just contact accounts payable to just understand what the next steps are in that process. Leases of qualified property are also eligible for partial sales tax exemption when payments are due and paid in the exemption period of July 1st through June 30th, 2022, regardless of the inception date. So the partial sales tax process or exemption does go on until 2022. So For leases as well as for any qualified property, we can claim partial sales tax exemption until 2022. So now let's just look at the seller lesser section of the exemption certificate. So this is where the shopper should enter the supplier name and the primary fulfillment address of that supplier. If they do not know the address associated to the supplier, they could leave it blank, since that information is recorded in the vendor profile or in the vendor database. For qualified property, the shopper needs to identify how the property will be primarily used. If it's for manufacturing, for research and development, to maintain, repair, measure any property, and so on. You'll notice that the majority of the property will be used for number 2, so for research and development. But the other 4 options are, the other 3 options are available as well. After the shopper has identified how the property will be used, they'll need to enter a precise description of the qualified tangible personal property in the section provided. So it's really important that the item is described in detail, because if there's any issues with the supplier later on, at least it's recorded on the exemption certificate, the details of the purchase. So there's only a certain amount of space available on the form. If you need additional space, you could always attach it on a separate sheet. The last section is the shopper verification section. And this section does contain some fields that are UC Berkeley specific. The information for those fields are listed here, and that would be the name of the purchaser and the permit number. So these 2 fields will always be required to be filled out, as well as the other fields. But this isn't, these fields contain information that are not specific to a department. So the name of the purchaser should always be University of California, Berkeley. The person signing on behalf would be the shopper or whoever the department has deemed who has access or the authority to sign that form. The permit number, which is our reseller number, is also required to be entered, and this is specific to Berkeley. So we've listed the number here, and then we've also listed it on the website communication that we've developed. But again, both of these sections do have to be completed, and the information that needs to be populated is listed here. So that was just going over the exemption certificate. I want to go over now the BearBuy process. So what happens in BearBuy for these partially sales tax exempt orders? So a couple reminders when it comes to the process in BearBuy is that all qualified products, including catalog items, must be ordered on the non-catalog form. So if a shopper has identified an item as qualifying that's available through a hosted or punch-out catalog, the shopper will need to purchase or request that item via the non-catalog form. They should not place the order through the catalog, since we don't have the opportunity to notify the supplier of the exemption if we just shop through the catalog. The non-catalog form gives us the ability to notify the supplier when the purchase order is sent to them of the exemption. Users also cannot mix qualified and non-qualifying products on the same cart. The cart will not be accepted if submitted with both products. So if part of an order does consist of qualifying items and the other half, the other part has non-qualified items, you'll have to break that order up separately. All qualifying items should be processed on the same cart. This is mainly because the taxability flag that was created in BearBuy is at the header level, not at the line level. So it will affect everything in the cart regardless of the supplier or form selected. So that's why we say just keep all qualified products together. Don't mix any non-qualifying products in that order. A certificate of exemption must be completed for every qualifying product or item. So this just mainly refers to the actual products being purchased. You should complete an exemption certificate, or the shopper should complete an exemption certificate for every item being purchased. So if you're purchasing 5 different items where all 5 items qualify, you'll need to attach 5 different certifications. versus if you're purchasing the same item 5 times, you'll only need to supply one certification. Again, the partial sales tax checkbox must be selected if the cart contains a qualifying order. And I do have a couple screenshots of what this checkbox looks like, so we'll review it later in the deck. Retroactive refunds of sales and use tax are also available, but you'll have to, or the shopper will have to contact accounts payable. Accounts payable will have to determine who the refund needs to be, who needs to issue the refund, if it's either the state or the supplier. Once that's been identified, accounts payable will instruct the shopper or the department that contacted them of the next steps. And if you have any questions regarding the retroactive refund process, just contact accounts payable at disperse@berkeley.edu. So this is the workflow process in BearBuy. I just wanted to show you an overall picture of what this process looks like, as well as who's involved in making sure that correct sales tax application happens. So the first part is the identification of the item as well as the documentation requirements. And that is included in step 1, where the shopper does the majority of the work. And I'm going to go into details on what those steps are or what is involved in the shopper step. But I did want to show you the shopper will have to self-identify the transaction. The rec creator just reviews and confirms that it qualifies, as well as documentation requirements are met. If the transaction routes to the requisition approver will again just confirm the order. If the transaction also requires a buyer to review the transaction, they will just ensure that the order, the certificate is attached, and that an external note the rec creators are responsible for attaching is attached. But the majority of the correct sales tax application happens during steps 6 through 11B, and that's what accounts payable is mainly responsible for doing. So they are definitely going to review all these transactions that were previously flagged as partially sales tax exempt, and will apply the correct sales tax based on the products being purchased. Okay. But let's look at step 1 a little bit more in detail. Okay. Again, the shopper is responsible for completing the partial exemption certificate for manufacturing, research, and development equipment. Okay. The shopper must shop for the item using the non-catalog form, attaching the exemption certificate and a quote or estimate. Once the form is added to the cart, the shopper must identify the order in BearBuy by selecting the California partial sales tax checkbox in the buyer info section of the cart. So you'll see the checkbox listed under the Summary tab in the Buyer Info section. To modify that flag, the shopper or even the rec creator can select the Edit button in that section, select the proper checkbox, and then save. Okay. If a transaction does not need a buyer to be involved, you should not select the checkbox, Buyer Intervention. You should only select it if you need a buyer involved in that to review that transaction. Only because they're listed next to each other doesn't mean you have to select both. You should only select buyer intervention needed if it's truly needed. Another thing to note is the exemption certificate can also be attached to the Comments tab. We recommend to do it on a non-catalog form since they're working on the form directly, but attaching it on the Comments tab is also acceptable. When it comes to the requisition creator will review all the orders to verify if the cart has been flagged as partially sales tax exempt. If it has been flagged, they'll have to perform this additional review. Okay. So the requisition creator, if the order has been flagged as partially sales tax exempt, needs to review the order to see that it does not contain any mixed items, meaning qualified and non-qualified products. If the rec creator should also verify that the order does qualify, and if the order does not qualify, the rec creator is responsible for unselecting the checkbox and notifying the shopper. Again, these transactions should only be processed on the non-catalog form, with the exception of the sole source form. That one, because of the nature of the purchase, should remain on the sole source form, but it still should be flagged as partially sales tax exempt. The rec creator should verify that the certification is complete, signed, and attached. And the requisition creator is responsible for adding a note in the external note and attachment section in order to notify the supplier of this exemption that we're going to take. So this is the way we are going to communicate these orders to our suppliers. If the note is not included in the external note and attachment section, the supplier will not be notified. So it is really important for rec creators to add this note in the correct section. The website that we created does host this note on it. So at the end, I will navigate to where that's listed, so you can see where you could access it today and going on. Again, the rec creator should confirm that a quote or estimate is attached. Since some of these transactions may be punch-out or hosted catalog-based, a screenshot of the pricing in BearBuy is acceptable as supporting documentation. For requisition approvers and buyer review, it just follows a normal process. So if a transaction is greater than 1,000 but less than 5, it will route to a requisition approver to review. They'll just confirm that the order qualifies and will conduct their normal review. If a transaction is greater than 1,000 and greater than or equal to 5,000, again, it'll route to the requisition approver. But then at that point, it will also route to a buyer. The buyer will review to ensure that the flag is selected. And if it's selected, the buyer will add an appropriate PO clause if needed. So if the requisition creator omits the external note, the buyer will be able to add a clause. But this only applies to transactions that will route to a buyer. So that is why we require that all transactions include that external note, and the responsibility for adding that note lies with the requisition creator. So that concludes the process. In terms of resources and support, we have some available online resources. We have communicated this process to campus by creating a web page. So the web page contains program information, which includes descriptions, what qualifies, what doesn't, as well as links to the newly developed job aid, which is geared towards shoppers. So you could access that web page today. You'll just have to navigate to the supply chain management website. I'll do that right now. We have created the web page and hosted it under the Buying tab. And it's the second one on the left-hand side. So it's CA partial sales tax rate exception. So this site, again, just goes over what qualifies, links to the SBOE site, as well as the legislation. The UC Berkeley permit number, since it has to be included on the exemption certificate. Contacts for the department. And towards the bottom of the page, it does list out the links to the actual exemption certificate hosted by the SBOE, the link to the job aid we created for shoppers, and UCOP guidelines that have been published for all UCs. Right below that CA partial sales tax rate exemption link is placing an exemption order. So when you select that, you will see the instructions that we have for campus. So again, it just states where the responsibility lies for filling out that exemption certificate, how to assemble these orders, meaning don't mix any qualified, non-qualified items, as well as the department and shopper responsibilities. This is also where the supplier note that requisition creators will need to add is listed. It's listed under partial sales tax exemption, external note to suppliers. So this is available now, and it's live for all users to access. So when it comes to questions, if you have a tax-related question, you'll have to send it to accounts payable, and their email address is dispersed@berkeley.edu. And this also includes any retroactive refund questions. All other questions should be sent to BearBuy Help. Their phone number, email address, and hours of operations are listed in front of you. And it's just the normal help desk number that we have already established. So that's what I have in terms of the presentation.